Hey everyone, Clio here, and today we're going to talk about my best and worst books per month for 2020. So this video is taken directly from Haley and Bookland's channels for her 2020 Bookmas schedule. She indicated that she was going to film this, and I thought it was a great idea. I actually think it's a subscriber of Haley who proposed this, and it's just a wonderful way to go through the year, and it's going to propose some interesting challenges, I'm sure, because it's already difficult enough to create your sort of best books of the year video, but there you can put like certain books on that you might have read in the same month. So for a single month there might be cases in which I have to choose a mediocre book as a best book, and other months in which I have to make decisions between like two books that I absolutely loved. So let's go through it. In January I read quite a lot. I read a lot of shorter books that month because I had like a challenge to read all of my under 200 page books, and I think like instantly what's already grabbing me is The Housekeeper and the Professor, which was just an absolutely great book that I read that month. But I also read Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata that month. So those are two books that I read that month that I absolutely love. I'm just quickly checking the rest for January. And for January it seems like those are really like the two standouts. So it's difficult to say. Convenience Store Woman talks a lot about like being a female who steps out of what a conventional role is for a female, but even like not just for females, it's also looking at like the way in which we undervalue certain jobs, and that it's like not accepted that you want to keep doing a certain job or that you want to keep taking on a certain position that isn't valued within society. And then The Housekeeper and the Professor is this book about this beautiful relationship that builds between two people, and how human relationships aren't necessarily all that dependent upon things such as memories, for example, because the person who we are following, the professor in this story, he doesn't really have memories. He cannot maintain memories for longer than 80 minutes. And so it is very much about how he still manages to have this deep and profound relationship with his housekeeper, even though they cannot really build or establish a relationship in a traditional sense of the word. So I love both of these a lot, and I think that I'm gonna go with The Housekeeper and the Professor. I think that there's just a beauty to the emotional atmosphere that is built within that book. Convenience Store Woman I thought was very well done, and I absolutely highly recommend it, but there's just something a little bit extra to The Housekeeper and the Professor in my memory. So that one is gonna win my best book. That's a worst book. I've seen the winner at this point in time. So the winner is gonna be The Body Artist by Don DeLillo, which is a book that, it's very short, as every book was within that month, but it was such a struggle to get through. So we are following this woman who is grieving over the loss of her sort of like lifelong companion, and she is a contortionist artist, and she starts like seeing this presence within her house, but it's also about how she transforms through contortionism and things like. It was very weird. I didn't know what to think of it. I couldn't really follow a lot of the time, and I also didn't really have an interest in figuring out what was happening because it was kind of boring in my opinion. So yeah, that is going to be my worst one. So moving on to February. In February, first of all, Before the Coffee Gets Cold, perfect book. So there are so many good ones already, I see. So really love Before the Coffee Gets Cold. Really love Spring by Ellie Smith. It's like the first Ellie Smith that I absolutely have loved. Then we get to A Monster Calls. Oh, that's also so beautiful. A Woman Is No Man, also definitely a great one. Kim Ji-young, born 1982. Loved it. The Fifth Season. Oh, Jesus. Okay. I'm gonna leave The Fifth Season. I do have multiple books within that series that I read, and I gave The Fifth Season 4 stars, and I think I gave the Obeliskate 5, so maybe the Obeliskate can make it. So I think I'm gonna go between like A Monster Calls and Spring by Ellie Smith. I also really love the book Before the Coffee Gets Cold, but I didn't give it as high of a rating. I think it's gonna be A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness. A Monster Calls was just such a beautiful, gloomy, intense emotional experience to read. So it's a story about a boy dealing with his mother being severely ill, his mother being diagnosed with cancer and possibly dying. And so it's all about that emotional state, about the sadness of it, but very much also the anger of it. And so it is beautifully portrayed through this story, and the illustrations just really set a mood for it. It's a very short one because of like, it has a length that is over 200 pages, but it does have a whole lot of illustrations in it, so it is very fast to get through. So I would highly recommend that one. I very much enjoyed what it was doing, you know, the way in which it was portraying his emotions and really personifying his emotions into an actual monster. So love that book. Yeah. Worst book. Right. So worst book for February. Tales and Poems by Edgar Allan Poe is definitely a contender, but that's just because I didn't realize that that was an edition of it that only had like the random stories. It didn't have his sort of like macabre horror stories in it, which was what I was actually looking for. The Binding by Bridget Collins, definitely a contender, but then that's also kind of mean to do it, because I did love the second part of this novel so much, and a big part of what I don't like about it is the way in which it was marketed. Yeah, it's gonna have to be between those two. So I'm gonna go with Tales and Poems by Edgar Allan Poe. Moving on to the month of March. So in March I read Fate of the Fallen. I definitely liked a lot. Grief is the Thing with Feathers. Why did I give that 4 stars? Yeah, so there's no like one book that immediately I'm like, that's going to be the one. I'm gonna go with Fate of the Fallen. It's a fantasy that not a whole lot of people read. I have seen a couple of people read it this year. So it's the first book in a fantasy series in which we're kind of following the sidekick. So we're setting up our stories with two kind of heroes going off on an adventure. We have the hero figure himself, who's been destined to save the land, and then we have his sort of like best friend who tags along. And within the first like, I don't know, 20 pages of the story or something, the hero dies, and so the sidekick decides to take on that mission and to continue the quest. I know that a lot of people dislike it a little bit because it has a very different style to it. This is not my first Cal Kate, and I very much actually like her style. But I do like the comic tone to this book, and I kind of like the way in which it's like mocking fantasy and his fantasy tropes a little bit throughout this book. And so it's not going to be for everybody. I do like her sort of like protagonist in her stories. The protagonists are always these sort of like highly charismatic characters who themselves don't realize that they have all this charisma and that they have this ability to draw people to them because of their sort of like integrity. They're kind of like Aragon characters, but not as noble as Aragon, but they are these sort of like, what is it called, like a Renaissance man, somebody who has all this ability and all this integrity, and that just instantly draws people into them. So I very much like that one. It wasn't perfect, but definitely out of the bunch that I have here for March, I would definitely say that that was the best one. And then in terms of the least likely, I think Andromeda Strain is definitely a very good contender for that. I also gave The Vile Village only 2 stars, Lemony Snicket's book, but I think that's just a comparative rating compared to other works within this series. I think I'm going to go with The Andromeda Strain by Michael Crichton. So I very much like Michael Crichton. One of my favorite books of all time, Jurassic Park, is by Michael Crichton. But I do have a sort of hit and miss relationship with him, where it's never a full miss, but it's just like some of his work kind of leave me indifferent, or I just find him to be mediocre. And with The Andromeda Strain, the problem was this is a pandemic book. It's kind of like a satellite or something like that returns from space, and it's carrying like lands, like it's carrying Earth from a comet or something like that, and that piece of Earth actually carries a sort of virus or bacteria with it. And so it is a pandemic book, and maybe that was part of the problem because I was expecting way bigger scopes than this book actually entails. But also the narrative style was what was kind of bothering me about this one, because it's very much told through like case files and things like that, so it has a very dry bones, very like report style to its narration. There are other parts of the book as well, but a lot of it just felt like that dry to me, which just wasn't very fun to read. It very much slowed down my reading a lot, and also the end of this book I didn't really love. Moving on to April, Magic Strings of Frankie Presto, definitely like that one. So I'm gonna say that I'm gonna give Saga my top spot. So I've read 3 volumes in the Saga comic book series within the month of April. I didn't give the first one very high rating, but that's just because I felt it to be super introductory and it didn't really leave me with an idea of do I want to continue or not. But then as of volume 2, I've given almost every single issue within this comic book series 5 stars. I think there's only one that I rated a little bit lower as well. But so Saga is a sci-fi comic book series which is kind of sort of like Romeo and Juliet story. We have these 2 characters from opposing races who are basically at war with one another. They fall in love despite the circumstances, but then they kind of have to go on the run. They also have a baby on the way. And so while that sounds like just a generic plot, I really love these sort of humor in there, but I also very much love the representation for it, but also the thematics that it kind of really tackles. It tackles some very heavy subjects in a comic book series, and it tackles them in a very nice, light way that I definitely think it works very well for the series. In terms of my least liked book in April, like everything is just like a 3-star rating, which is kind of difficult to then determine what you like least, you know. I'm gonna end up going with Somewhere I'll Find You by Lisa Kleypas. This is a romance book. I think it's the only romance I read in 2020. I haven't really been grabbing back to the romance genre. There's been a while where I read so much romance in a year. When I first discovered romance, I really found it super addicting, and so I read romance after romance after romance, but then I kind of got annoyed with myself for that because I felt like they were basically all the same, you know, they were following that same formula. There was nothing really new or surprising that they could offer after a while, and so I just found them all blending into one. And so at the end of the year I was like, yeah, what did I actually read this year? What were the standout romances? I don't know, they all blend into one. So I don't really read romance all that often anymore, but so I did read this one, and I gotta say I don't remember what this one is about at all, so that also says something. So romance, yeah, at least historical romance, which is what I've been reading a lot at that point in time. I don't think I'm gonna go back to that anymore. Moving on to May. In the month of May we have Invisible Women Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. Very important book, very much loved that one. What else? Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. And some more Saga, which I'm not going to put on there again. And then some rereads. Already know which one is going to be the worst one. An Orchestra of Minorities. The Traveling Cat Chronicles. Alright, so it's gonna go between The Traveling Cat Chronicles and Orchestra of Minorities. In terms of surprising me, An Orchestra of Minorities definitely takes that one. It was nominated for the Man Booker Prize, so that would mean, okay, it's probably a very good book because, you know, you don't just get a nomination for that just like that. But everybody who was talking about the Booker Prize was kind of disregarding this book. Nobody mentioned it, it seemed like. It was always just like, when people were talking about the front runners for this race, this book was always kind of forgotten. So when I was going into it, I also didn't really know what to expect. I knew it was an Odyssey retelling, but that also gave me a totally wrong idea about what this story was actually going to be like. So this book completely took me by surprise, and so I think it's gonna be my best one, yes. So An Orchestra of Minorities is about a farmer in Nigeria called Chinonso, and he basically starts off as this wholesome character who he has a chicken farm. He's always had this sort of affinity with chickens, and so it's been his life dream to own a chicken farm. And he has a very good situation in life where, you know, he's able to maintain the way he wants to live his life through his chicken farm. But then at the very beginning of this book he has this sort of chance encounter with this woman, and he saves her life, and they have this sort of bond with one another as a result, and he becomes in love with her. And that's kind of where his downfall starts, because she is from a higher part of the society. She is very much of the wealthier side of society, and so he will be striving to prove himself worthy of her towards her family as well. And in so doing he will make a lot of difficult, bad decisions, but also people will very much be working against him, trying to keep him in his place, even lowering his situation in life. So it's very much a look at a character who starts off in a great high place in life and seeing his downfall, where, you know, just not just his life circumstances have been altered, but also his emotional circumstances and the way in which he sees the world or the way in which he acts very much will be taking a tumble down in this book. So Absolutely love this one. Worst book of the month. Worst book of the month was pretty easy. That's going to be Notes from a Small Island by Bill Bryson, which is a book that I DNF'd. I don't DNF easily, so it's easy to choose this one. So this is a travel novel, and I have read Bill Bryson before and I've really enjoyed his works, but this one really didn't work for me because it had a very grumpy style to it. So it was all about Bill Bryson, who was, before he was going to move back to the US, he was going to take one final tour of the UK and kind of say goodbye to this country that had been his home place for such a long time. And so that sounded like super wholesome, but that was then paired with like a sort of like grumpy old man vibe to it, even though it wasn't even that old, I think, at the time that he wrote that one. But yeah, I just couldn't vibe with it very well. I just had to put it down because it was just making me feel frustrated. It was just making me feel unhappy reading it because I was kind of like sharing in his emotions, and I just didn't want to be in that place. So moving on to June. City of Brass, immediately a very good contender. I very much loved that first installment, very much loved the first 2 installments within that series. Poppy War, definitely also a good one. Kingdom of Comfort, I read it in the same month apparently. Wow. The Alchemist was... Yeah, I know which one it's gonna be. So Queenie by Candice Carter-Williams has to take this month. So Queenie is a sort of contemporary fiction work in which we're looking at this girl called Queenie, who kind of has... This is kind of the opposite of an Orchestra of Minorities. This is a kind of character who's kind of unraveled at the beginning of the story, and we're kind of going to hope that she's going to end up in a better place by the end of it. So Queenie is this character who has a little bit of a messy romance life. She's constantly hooking up, constantly has these sort of like one-night stands, has these relationships with guys who are totally fetishizing her, and so she is in such a bad mental space. She has so little self-worth that she allows these things to happen to her, and that she doesn't really seem to see that it is hurtful to her to allow men to objectify her in that way, or to allow men to have these sort of like super rough sex with her. So that's definitely also like trigger warnings. There is very graphic sex scenes within this book, and at the same time she's also like, she's somebody who wants to have more of an impact at her work. She wants to have more of an impact when it comes to like putting Black Lives Matter issues to the forefront of the attention, but at the same time she's also totally neglecting the responsibility of her work, and she's very much not taking accountability for what she's doing at work. She's a frustrating character to read from, definitely at the beginning of the book, but I definitely also grew to love her throughout this one. It's also very much a therapy positive book, which I absolutely adored about it, but it's also going to be looking at like family dynamics, cultural dynamics, and the stigma that can be attached to therapy in terms of like your family looking down upon the issue, your culture looking down upon having therapy. And so I very much love this book, and you know, it might make it's making it onto my best books of the year, but I don't know where it's going to land in the end because I haven't made that decision yet. Worst book for June. So I think I saw, yeah. So the easy one here is Leon and Juliette by Aniette van der Zijl. This is a very short book. It is a book week gift, so it's a free gift that we get here during book week, and it is always like, it's most often poor quality, but usually it's just like mediocre. But this one really, I really dislike this one because it's basically a story about a white man going to the US, falling in love with a black slave, bringing her back with him to the Netherlands, and it's really going to try to sell that as a love story apparently. But what's more of a problem is like not just the fact that it's tried to do that in like 90 pages, because apparently it's not. Apparently it's like a study before she will actually write a full-length novel, but it was just basically a summary of this person's life because it's based on real events. But so basically this is just like, if you are intending to write a book about a subject and you want to read up on it, this is kind of the summary of her research that she did into it before she's going to write a book. So that was totally, it's not fun to read those things. It's not fun to read somebody's summary of research. So that was really a waste of my time. So in July, sadly read the third book in the Daevabad trilogy, and whereas everybody else considers the third book the best one, for me that one really was so mediocre. Seeing some good contenders for worst book here. Yeah, so this is why I made sure not to choose the 5th season before, because I did rate The Obelisk Gate 5 stars. And so The Obelisk Gate is going to win Best Book for July. So The Obelisk Gate is the second book in the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, which is a trilogy in which we're looking at a world that has kind of been destroyed at some point in time, and it's going into these sort of seasons, which are basically these sort of like mass extinction events in which there's so much seismic activity that the Earth is kind of barely still producing any sort of, what do you call that, any sort of resources, and so it's very difficult for humanity to survive. And within this world you have these people who actually do have the power to control earthquakes and things like that. However, they're very much looked down upon. And it's a very great series. It is definitely a difficult one in the sense that you will feel confused for a very long time, especially in the first book, and you know, it's very much a no hand-holding fantasy in the sense that it's not going to explain things to you. You're really going to have to try and keep up as you're reading and try and figure out what is happening that way, because it is easy to be lost within this one. So I wouldn't say that it's like, if you've never read fantasy, probably not where you want to go. But if you've read a lot of fantasy, this is a perfect book to pick up, because it's going to feel very different from the usual fantasy that you've probably been reading. And you know, I just personally loved it. I really just thought it was a breath of fresh air. Every single book within the series has won the Hugo Awards, which is also very important to mention, because, you know, it's already a good thing to win the Hugo Awards, of course, but to do it consecutively with 3 books in one trilogy is quite a feat. Worst book for July? So we have Quixote by Salman Rushdie, which is definitely a contender. We have Nightboat to Tangier by Kevin Barry, which is also a contender. I'm going to go with Quixote by Salman Rushdie. This is a Don Quixote retelling, and while the premise of this was interesting, so the idea would be that in this case Don Quixote, or the character who refers to himself as Don Quixote, is driven mad by watching too much reality TV. So in the original it's because of reading too many sort of like general fiction novels, but so in this retelling it would be he is watching too much reality TV, and so one of the reality TV hosts becomes his sort of like love interest, his Dulcinea. And so whereas I very much loved that premise and that setup, it didn't really deliver on it, because we have just too many perspectives that we're following. We're looking at this story from different levels, because we have the Don Quixote retelling part, but then we also follow the author who is writing the Don Quixote retelling, and then we also know that there's a level of a writer who has written both of these different levels to the story. And so I do like metafiction, but because of that split within different levels, we didn't get enough attention all the time on the Don Quixote retelling part, which was what actually drew me into this story. And so I kind of felt like that story sometimes fell by the wayside. What I liked about this book was the meta levels, and was the sort of like idea of reality blending with fiction within those levels as well. I did like elements to this story, but overall it just felt too fractured, and because of all of those different, and because we had too many different POVs, we never got to spend enough time with certain POVs in my point of view. Then we go into August. So How We Disappeared by Jing Jing Lee, definitely loved that one. The Seven Perfection, yes. Tin Man by Sarah Winman, it has a higher rating, but I think the 2 other ones actually stuck with me a little bit more. Saya, I'm not going to repeat that one. Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo, yeah, also great. Loveless by Alice Oseman. So August is gonna be a difficult one. So I'm gonna go between Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo and The Seven Perfection by Daniel Polanski. I think I need to go between those 2. And in that sense, I'm going to go with... It's difficult, guys. So I really love The Seven Perfection, and The Seven Perfection is a book that will stick with me longer because of originality cases, and originality is very important to me. The Clap When You Land, I'm going to give it to... I'm going to give it to Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo, okay? So Clap When You Land is a YA contemporary novel in which we're looking at these two girls who share the same father. So one of them permanently lives with her father in New York, while the other one lives with her mother in the Dominican Republic, and her father comes to visit her for a month every single year. Now these girls do not know about each other's existence, but so they find out about one another when their father dies in a plane crash when he's going to the Dominican Republic. And so I very much loved, first of all, it's a novel in verse, absolutely loved that. I listened to the audiobook, which is narrated by the author herself, and that's really the way to go because it really lands a lot of the punches, a lot of the impact of the story. The language is beautiful within this one, and just the rhyming, you know, the rhythm to it really elevates that beautiful language as well. But it's also going deeply into cultural issues for starters, but also very much looking at the reality of the way in which girls are viewed by boys in this world, the way in which girls have to deal with the male gaze throughout their childhood, throughout the rest of their lives. And so I thought that those scenes were really powerful and impactful, as well as of course looking at grief and the way in which these girls have to deal with grief and have to deal with an image of their father being destroyed, and kind of looking at them having to realize that their parents aren't perfect. And so yeah, I very much love this one and I have no regrets. This is my best book for August. Worst book for August. So I think that one is going to go to either The Bass Rock or Alone Together. I'm gonna go with Alone Together, Love, Grief and Comfort in the Times of COVID-19. This is a short story collection. It's an anthology, which it's not a short story collection, it's an anthology. It has a lot of essays mainly, or poems, or some things like that. It's written by different authors during COVID-19. And while I like the idea of looking at different experiences during COVID-19, it really didn't work that well for me just because there wasn't enough coherency to it. I think anthologies always suffer from the fact that some works are better than others, but in this one I definitely felt that there were too many entries into this anthology that really just left me indifferent, that I really didn't have a strong opinion about, or that really didn't land any sort of a punch. I think I like the grief section of this book the most, looking at people who had lost somebody, not necessarily due to COVID or due to them dying during COVID-19, but also, for example, relationship strain and you know, breakups and things like that during this period in time. You know, in principle, I think it works on a level of recognition. You can easily recognize parts of your reality during COVID-19 within this anthology, but that just didn't really do much to me at this point in time. Maybe once like this whole situation is over, this sort of anthology would work better, but living through it, I don't really have that much of an interest in reading about it. And then we get to September. Okay, so best book for September is going to be The Gospel of Loki by Joanne M. Harris, which is a Loki retelling in which we're looking at Norse mythology through the lens of Loki himself. And I didn't really know too much about Norse mythology to begin with, so a lot of these stories were quite new to me and I very much enjoyed looking at them. I very much found them to be very funny and very interesting mythologies that they have there. You know, I feel like a lot of times I'm mainly acquainted with like Greek mythology and those types of stories, and there's less humor in there than there is in the Norse myths, so I definitely want to be exploring Norse mythology a little bit more. But it's also great to look at the character of Loki, because Loki's then a trickster, sort of like, he's a little bit of a sort of like minx. He's a good character, but at the same time he cannot help like prank people or like do things that have negative effects to other people and then kind of gloat on it. But at the same time we're also looking at we're also finding out throughout this book that it's usually coming from an innocent place, and that while sometimes the effects of his actions are harsh and horrible and he acts as if they leave in him differently, they do have an impact on him, and he does very much care about these characters, even though he probably won't admit that. And so I very much fell in love with this character and this narrative voice throughout, and I'm very much eager to dive into its sequel, because I don't know what it's going to go into, because I don't know Norse mythology. But yeah, I very much enjoyed this one. I would definitely highly recommend this. And then the worst book for September is going to be either Mordew, which was super disappointing and very difficult for me to get through. The New Wilderness, definitely also one that I didn't like. And A Single Thread by Tracy Chevalier. Yeah, I have 3 for September, so September is basically the worst reading month of 2020 it seems. So worst one for September, I'm gonna put Mordew, because it's a fantasy book about a very dark, grim world. We're looking at this boy growing up in the slums who discovers he has some sort of power that brings him to the attention of the master of the city. And while I loved the sort of like darkness of this world, and I liked that the author was introducing like sort of like new fantasy elements, or like unlike like fantasy elements that were kind of unlike traditional fantasy elements. They were like kind of reminded me of like this sort of like fantastical, nonsensical fantasy characters you might find in a sort of like children's novel. While I liked that aspect to it, it was just difficult to get through. I would read like 10 pages of this book and feel like I'd been reading forever. And I don't really fully know what was wrong with the book, why it didn't grab my attention or anything like that, but it was just a struggle to get through, and I suffered. It was just such a struggle to get through, and the book didn't pay out in the end for me. So yeah, this is going to be, it's probably my biggest disappointment of the year in that sense. Moving on to October. So October doesn't really have a huge standout read to me, so it's going to be between Piranesi and Little Eyes, which are both a little bit more on the sort of like weird side of things. And I think I'm going to go with Piranesi. So Piranesi lives in this house with this sort of like endless amount of rooms to it. It very much has this sort of like seaside aspect to me. I mean, I really associate with it like, a seaside setting, because there's this sort of tide coming into the house, and so it will flood the rooms at the lowest level of this house at certain times of the day. And Piranesi is very much the master of this house. He knows vast majority of the rooms within it. He has explored a very big part of the room, of the house. He has all this data on the tides and on things that are within this house. But one day a new person is entered into the house, and that kind of stirs things up. It is very weird, it's very great. I very much loved the atmosphere of the read, and if you look up the artist Piranesi, I think it also enhances the experience, because then you get these sort of like weird architectural sketches that he drew, and that really sets the tone for the way in which this world now looks within my mind. And yeah, I just thought it was very interesting. It went to interesting places. It was not what I expected, but I definitely did like the experience a whole lot. Worst one for October. It's gonna be difficult, it seems, because I don't really have a bad read. So I'm gonna have to pick a 3-star read, and I have said that I won't pick rereads for best book, so I'm also not picking rereads for worst book, not that I want to necessarily pick The Fellowship. It's going to be then between The English Patient and Get a Life, Chloe Brown. Two very different books with two very different reading experiences. But so where The English Patient is slow, beautiful language, and very much looking deep into characters, Get a Life, Chloe Brown is a romance novel. It is fast-paced, it is fun, it has chronic illness representation, but I think I'm going to go with Get a Life, Chloe Brown in the end, because while I very much love the chronic illness representation and I liked the couple within this one, I do think that there are quite some problems with the setup for this one. I don't really buy into the sort of initial hate relationship between the two of them. But so I feel like there was a little bit too much animosity at the beginning, and that I didn't fully buy into the reason why there was animosity between the two. And whereas I definitely love them as a couple later on within the book, I also didn't think there was enough of an interest to their romance development to really get me going. So I'm gonna say that that one is my worst book of, what month are we? October. Moving on to the month of November. So in November, like best book, it's gonna be easy, I think. Let me make sure that I'm not forgetting anything here. Yeah, best book, Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson, so the 4th book in the Stormlight Archive. My most anticipated book for 2020. It did not disappoint. It was different than what I expected, because it's very much more centered around certain storylines than on all of them as it usually does. And so that is definitely something that you could find a problem with this book, but for me personally it's focused on all of the storylines that I was most intrigued about, while still also offering a sort of like interesting side storyline for one of the other characters that I like, but and not going into the character, one of the main POVs that I don't like as much. But so I won't go into too much with this one. It is an epic 10-part series that Brandon Sanderson is working on. The first 5 books are going to form a story together, so this is the 4th installment. So we're getting down to a big showdown that is set up for book 5, and this one very much has a lot of Cosmere connections. So a lot of books that Brandon Sanderson works on are part of the Cosmere, which is kind of the universe that he is creating within his fantasy world, and so this one has a lot of connections between different books and was very rewarding in that sense as well to read. And yeah, I just very much loved the way we were taking certain characters within this book. Very much loved the storyline for one of the characters I absolutely loved. Very much fell in love with a character that I was indifferent to within this one. And like, we took some characters that had been on the sidelines, but giving them a more prominent role. And while I would have loved to see that go even further, there's still hope for the future, I guess. Least favorite for the month of November. Well, I'm gonna have to say No One Is Too Small to Make a Difference by Greta Thunberg. That's just because of the way that it's structured. So this is a collection of all of her speeches that she has done, and a lot of her speeches contain the same elements to them, which is perfectly fine. You know, you're not giving these speeches one after another. There's time going in between there, and the facts aren't changing. So the fact that all of these speeches contain the same factual information is just normal. But if you then gather all of them together in a sort of collection and you read them one after another, it becomes very circular, it becomes very repetitive. But as a work to digest, it's not really all that interesting or all that fun to read in that sense. And then we get to December, in which case, at this point in time, I've only read one book. If I'm gonna make a prediction for this month, best book for December. So, like, I'm not gonna give The Stone Sky. The Stone Sky could be a very great book, but I already gave The Obelisk Gate the win in some months, so I'll just leave that one out. I don't know what to think about Weather. I don't know what my experience with that is going to be, because the plot premise is also too vague for that. I have a reread which won't count. I have The Count of Monte Cristo, which I will say at this point in time I'm liking it a lot, but I don't think it's gonna be like a 5-star read. So I think I'm gonna give it to Before the Coffee Gets Cold, Tales from the Cafe. I couldn't give it to Before the Coffee Gets Cold in February because I gave it a 4-star rating, but I have cried 3 times reading Before the Coffee Gets Cold too. I don't think I had to cry when I read the first book in the series, and it also manages to kind of expand upon what we'd already gotten in the first one and to offer us an interesting realization that's going to make it that we can reread the first one and get more out of it the second time around because of information we've been given in Before the Coffee Gets Cold too. So I absolutely respect this one, and that is my prediction for my best book. Worst book of the month, Dark Places by Gillian Flynn. If I don't DNF it, I'm definitely going to probably only give it a 3-star rating, because I cannot see how it could get higher than that, considering I'm halfway through and I've had to drag myself to that point within the book at this point in time. So, I mean, the fact that I'm mentioning this as a prediction should mean that I DNF it, but I'm just so bad at DNFing. But so in Dark Places we basically have this family drama take place in the past, and so there was this one girl who survived the drama, and she pointed to her brother as the one who had committed the murders, and he's then landed in prison. The rest of the family has been killed, and she is contacted by this group of people who want to examine these murders again and who believe that her brother is innocent. And so since she needs the money, she is willing to accept that deal. First of all, I think the character is extremely dislikable, which is part of the reason, I guess, why this is not vibing with me, but also just I don't like Mystery Thriller all that much because I don't really care about who did it. I still at this point in time don't care to find out whether it was indeed her brother who did it, whether it was her father, whoever it might be. I don't really care, and I also don't really make conjectures when I do thrillers. So I think that that is a big part of the reason why people like it. It's just kind of try and figure out who did it and see whether they were right about who did it. But I don't care, and so I don't make these conjectures. And so the only way in which a thriller could then win my heart is being like super fast paced or having a super rewarding ending. And super fast paced is definitely not the case. And the rewarding ending, no matter how rewarding it's going to be, it's not going to be worth me dragging through it. So that should be my you need to DNF this book talk, but we'll see. But so yeah, that is my best and worst books per month for 2020. I definitely enjoyed looking at this, and it has some difficult decisions to make, and like I think some of the most difficult are when you have like months where there are no standouts, but it's of course more heartbreaking to get to months where you have multiple standouts and you have to choose between ones of these. But so some of these can be reclaimed of course in my best books of 2020 video, which will be coming in the month of January. Normally the first week of January is when I will be doing the sort of like best books and worst books of 2020 type videos, so you can look forward to that one at that point in time. And some of these books that haven't won in a month might be reclaiming some spots within those videos. But so yeah, that is it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. Definitely let me know if you have any sort of opinion about some of the books that I put on here. If you're like going, why didn't you choose that one? Definitely let me know as well. And we can talk about it in the comments. See you guys for a future video. Bye!